What's up, you guys? Welcome back to the channel. On last episode, we pulled off the oil pan on the 1JZ and we discovered some unfortunate oil shavings and oil gunk depositing on the bottom of the oil pan. Therefore, we decided that we're gonna tear apart the engine, inspect the bearings, inspect the cylinder walls, inspect the piston rings, and more than likely, we're gonna send the motor out to a machine shop, get a full refresh, maybe even upgrade the pistons and rods, and have the motor bulletproof and ready for 500 horsepower of non-stop abuse while drifting. Alright, so I've removed the cams. That's actually the only way to get to the head studs. You really can't find your way in there without the cams being out of the way. And then, as we can see, this is the oil gunk up that we're talking about. You can see how stained the head is. There's some just nasty oil here, and this is all dried up. That is a very high indication of the oil being ran past its mileage or age, and the oil starts to break down and actually burn into these chunks. That's not a good sign. And then if you look at the caps for the camshafts, you can actually see the buildup on top of them as well. That's what we call gunking up. And that's why we're tearing this motor apart, because we are afraid that this stuff is actually in the oil ports, which could potentially cause oil starvation and oil pressure drops to critical areas that need to be lubricated. Other than that, the cams look pretty good. I don't see any excessive wear on them. Even the cam caps, they have some wear, which is normal for that kind of mileage on the engine. So we're actually not worried about any damage to the head at this point, other than that nasty buildup that we found. But once we send this to the machine shop, they're going to hot tank it. Everything's going to get cleaned. They're going to run pressure through all the ports, and they're going to make sure that everything is completely clean. Alright, so once you get the head off, you can actually take a look at the head gasket and sort of see how the engine was doing as far as holding the cylinder pressure, see if the head gasket was failing. Now, if you have a race engine, it's a very smart idea to look at your head gasket as soon as you pull the head off. That way you can sort of predict if there's any weak spots, something that needs attention, maybe the head's warped, maybe the block's warped, and it's creating some sort of a gap between the head and the block. In this case, because we are rebuilding this engine, and this engine wasn't technically raced before, we're not going to pay much attention to it, but there is something I wanted to bring up, because it is something we noticed early on when we were pulling the water pump off. We noticed that there was quite a bit of rust in this area here. I don't know if the camera is going to catch it as well, and then we did wash that block a little bit, so we washed some of it off, but we did notice that there was a lot of rust right in this area specifically, and then it was dry around it. So that got us to think that maybe the head gasket was starting to leak and it was leaking coolant, and over time this just became a little rusty. And looking at the head gasket here, I noticed that the black sealing on the head gasket is actually missing. In comparison to the back here, it's still present. And you can see it's generally present all around. Now when I pulled the head off, obviously some of it got lifted. So the first thing I did after that is I flip over the head. And I noticed that the gasket's actually missing here too. So that shows me that these are the water passages, and there was possibly some sort of an issue happening here. Maybe the head warped, or the block warped a little bit, and it created a little bit of passage for the coolant. So that kind of justifies that there may potentially have been a slow leak here. Probably wouldn't have been a big deal, but it could form worse over time as soon as we boost more into this engine. Also, another thing I noticed right away, which kind of caught my attention and made me scratch my head a little bit, is all this debris in cylinder 5. Now, when I did a leak down test on this engine, I pulled the spark plugs. And when you pull the spark plugs, the debris could fall into the engine. But I already know that from previous experience, so I grabbed a vacuum cleaner and I cleaned everything out as good as I could, knowingly, to make sure that nothing falls into the head. And you can actually see it on the head itself. There's not much debris left in here. Like I said, I cleaned it out pretty well. This is cylinder 5. You can see there's no debris around it, so it couldn't have gotten in there from just now when I pulled the spark plugs or when I did the leak down test. So that just goes to tell me that when the importer gets these engines, they do a quick compression test while the engine's still in the car, probably at a junkyard where it's been accumulating a lot of dirt and a lot of dust. They don't pay attention. They're just trying to get the job done as quick as possible, pull as many engines as they can. So they probably pull the spark plugs out and let all the debris fall into cylinder 5. Now that could have been catastrophic. If this engine was to be fired up and these tiny little particles were to get stuck between the cylinder and the piston, it could scrape that piston up really fast, and it could actually create a lower compression, or even worse, it could damage the valves on the way out or whatnot. So it is actually kind of a lucky situation here that we pulled the head. We weren't planning on to originally, but now that we did, we saw that, and that could have been pretty bad. Alright, so I got all the rods out with the pistons. I marked them down, cylinder 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Now, it is also smart to inspect your pistons, your rings, and your rods and your bearings when you pull them out. It'll kind of give you a better perspective of how healthy the engine is or was. And right away I noticed that all the pistons on the oil rings, it has a lot of gunk. Now, kind of expected that, seeing how the oil pan was and how the cylinder head was. This engine really was poorly maintained. This is all burnt oil just collecting in there. It kind of sucks. It's unfortunate. All this would definitely have to get replaced. The pistons would have to get cleaned. Other than that, the skirts on the pistons seem fairly good. I already looked at the cylinders. There's no scoring on the walls, so there was good lubrication happening. Maybe the owner of this car wasn't abusing it. They just simply weren't maintaining it. I get it. Some people are busy with their lives, busy with their schedules. Cars to them is just an accessory that gets them from point A to point B. So they don't really pay as much attention as we do, guys that race them. Other thing I noticed is the bearings. I took a look at it. There is somewhere on the outside edges, and I did find scoring on some of them, but again, it was minor, nothing to a point that I would say was catastrophic. One more thing, before you pull the crank out, it is nice to check and see if it spins freely. This one does, which indicates that there isn't any type of warpage on the crank itself or the main caps. This is always a good sign to see. That means the clearances are good, and more than likely the bearings and the caps are not going to have any issues with them. So I'm going to pull the crank out real quick, and then we're going to do the final inspection on the main caps, and we'll be all set. Guys, that's gonna wrap it up for this video. The whole engine's taken apart, ready to be taken to a machine shop. I already spoke to my buddy. It looks like we're gonna do aftermarket pistons and rods. We already have aftermarket cams, springs, and retainers, so might as well just fully build the engine, be safe. I know it's not necessary. I know these 1Js can hold 500 horsepower easily, and that's what the goal is going to be. But because this is going to be a race car, and these rods and pistons are old, they've been in there for 20 plus years, you might as well replace them if you got the budget for it. Make sure the whole motor is bulletproof, fully refreshed, and basically brand new. Hopefully you liked the video and the content. If you did, make sure you hit that like button. Comment down below with any questions or suggestions. And make sure you stay tuned to the channel. If you haven't subscribed already, please do so. There's going to be other content happening meanwhile. I know this engine's going to be at the machine shop for a while. I do have my S14 in the progress of rebuilding it. So I'm going to be throwing weekly episodes of that as well. And I'll catch you guys on the next one. Peace.